Do you remember the day that the Brexit vote happened?
I do remember. I was at a conference with my work abroad, and I remember feeling mainly sad that it was the end of an era, really.
I think we were shocked, weren't we?
Yeah, we didn't expect it.
We live in Wales, we're from Cardiff in the UK.
I remember I woke up to the news, UK votes to leave the EU, and I was like, yeah, didn't expect that to happen, so...
I was upset because it was so close, and also it was the over 65-year-olds who are the reason we left. And it's just going to be us facing the consequences. It's so frustrating.
People were stressing about Brexit, and I have family in Britain, and we didn't really know how we will see them.
I was in London, so I saw all the protests. For me, it was very rough to see that there was like one decision made, even though there were so many people like disagreeing on it.
I just woke up, it was the first news, and it made the future look very unpredictable, and I felt like the world was going in the wrong direction. I will never forget that day.
It'd be interesting to see if the vote went again, what way it would go.
That was our reporter Aaron Casey inviting people to go back in time to the morning after Thursday, the 23rd of June 2016, when 51.9% of UK voters chose to leave the European Union, while 48.1% favoured Remain. Brussels was shocked and wondering, what now? It took the EU and the UK then a very long time to answer that question, with the UK officially leaving the bloc on the 31st of January 2020. 1 decade after the Brexit vote, the shape of the UK-EU relationship is still unsure and up for constant debate. Welcome to Brussels, My Love, the podcast with me, Maeve McMahon. To delve into the 10-year mark of this historic moment for the European Union, I'm joined by the corporate lobbyist Conor Allen and our very own Shona Murray, a well-known face on Euronews. Shortly, we'll be checking what changed in the EU and the UK over the past decade. And we'll also ask, was Brexit a good idea? But first, do you recognise this jingle? That's the jingle from the well-known Europeans podcast, hosted by Katie Lee and Dominic Kramer. Born out of Brexit, the show has now racked up an impressive 4 million downloads. We had a special interview with them to mark this 10-year anniversary, and I started by asking them where they were when they heard the news.
I was working through the night, watching the results trickling in and watching my boss's face get more and more ashen as the hours went on.
Yeah, and I was living in Amsterdam, where I still am living, in fact. I'd recently got engaged to my Dutch husband, and I remember waking up thinking, oh, am I now having a visa wedding?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it was of course a shock. Although I'm a very anxious election observer, so unlike Katie, I saw it coming a mile off and was like, "Yep, we're going to vote to leave." So I was kind of prepared for it. But yeah, of course, like many other Brits living in the EU, we then had years of uncertainty, like not knowing what our situation was going to be, how long we were going to be able to stay here, all those things. Yeah, it feels like a very long time ago now, though.
It was. I mean, it's been a long 10 years and it took so long, as you say, to negotiate the exit deal. But it's funny you said you weren't shocked. Brussels was shocked. I was right here in the thick of it and they were so shocked. They didn't expect it. And so were you, Katie, as you said. But one of the positive outcomes, if you like, from the Brexit was the Europeans. Tell us how you got inspired really to create this very successful podcast.
Well, you know, Dominic and I had been friends for a long time already by the time we started making the podcast. We were friends at university. And by the time we started the podcast, we were in our late 20s. And both of us had found ourselves as Brits living on the continent, as British people tend to call Europe. And we spent a lot of our time both swapping podcast recommendations. But when we weren't doing that, we were trying to wrap our heads around why Brexit had happened. And one of the things that hit both of us quite strongly was how the European Union and Europe more broadly were talked about in our domestic British media in the run-up to the referendum. You know, Europe was always presented as something very boring, very dry, like something that you're never going to be able to understand. It's just like a bunch of old white men in suits making decisions that are really complicated.
I think Katie's maybe being a bit hard on the British media there. I do understand why they had a difficult time talking about what's happening in Brussels in an accessible way, because it is a really complicated political beast and it is so difficult to get your head around. We don't get educated about how it works when we're at school, or we didn't. But Katie's right. I mean, I realized I knew so much about the US political system. Like I was listening to 3 podcasts a week about US politics, and I thought, why am I not more aware of what's happening in the EU. And maybe the fact that I wasn't aware is one of the reasons why people from my home country decided to vote to leave this institution.
And now do you think you understand it 10 years after from producing the podcast?
We're better than we were. All of these things like European councils and various things like that, the institutions, we've been on a bit of a journey to trying to understand that, because the podcast is very much, it's not made from inside the Brussels bubble. No one on our team lives in Brussels. We very much see ourselves as just ordinary European citizens who are trying to figure out together, along with our listeners, how this very powerful beast actually works.
And Katie, has the EU, do you think, changed for the better or worse in the past 10 years?
I tend to be a bit of a sort of half glass full kind of person, and I would argue that the European Union has got a little bit better and stronger as a result of Brexit, which is not something I would have seen myself saying 10 years ago. And of course, it is full of disagreements on a daily basis between member states. But I do think that is this kind of little source of tranquility that we really need in these times when the world is so messy and unpredictable. Fewer people are looking at Brexit and saying, yeah, I think we should do a repeat of that locally.
And Dominic, when you hear this talk now of Brussels and London resetting their relationship, this summit will take place in July. And of course, after the local elections, talk of, the UK one day potentially rejoining. How does that make you feel?
I'm skeptical I'm skeptical of the fact that the UK will rejoin anytime soon. But I mean, it's not surprising that the UK and the EU are looking towards each other to become stronger partners, considering where we are right now with Trump's power and the fact that he's becoming a much less reliable partner for both the UK and the EU. So yeah, I'm skeptical, but also kind of pleased. My expectations are very, very low. In that sense, I guess I've kind of come to terms with Brexit and 10 years on.
Katie, we saw Brexit as well. It really tore the country apart. Did you fall out of any relationships because of the Brexit referendum?
I didn't, but it felt like a very sore point that I couldn't discuss with a few people. I only have one close friend who I know voted for Brexit, and we have still never discussed it 10 years on.
And Dominic, after your 10 years working with the Europeans, how would you describe Europe beyond, of course, the institutions and the politics?
Well, that's always the hardest question. I mean, I feel like we started this podcast hoping to be able to come up with a definition of what it meant to be European. And I still feel like we're searching. And maybe that in itself gives me the answer that Europe is so many different things. It's this tapestry of different culture, different backgrounds, different opinions. And we all work together. We all live together. We all are fighting for the greater good. That's my idealistic view of what Europe is.
I've kind of come to terms with the idea that the messiness is maybe a good thing, and it's part of who we are. That is part of our European identity. We speak so many different languages. We have so many different ideas about what the world should be. I do think in moments of crises, we realize what it is that holds us together. Dominic mentioned this idea of Brexit as making people feel more European. You saw the same thing after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. People suddenly realizing we know what it is to belong to this. We know what we have to fight for. And I think that's very powerful, even if we don't quite know what it is.
Very nice conclusion. And just before I let you go, what is the future of the Europeans podcast?
Another 10 years, Dominic?
Sure.
That was Katie Lee and Dominic Kramer there from the Europeans podcast. But now back to Brussels. We're here with Conor Allen and Shona Murray. And of course, June 2016, it feels like ages ago. I'd love to know, where were you and how did you feel when it happened? Conor?
I was an intern at the time and I had just moved to Brussels because I'm a young British man and I wanted to move to Europe and work in the European institutions. I had just moved here like 3 months afterwards. And I remember waking up. I was working in bars, actually. So I woke up quite late on the morning of the referendum. I woke up, looked at the results, and I felt like I'd been hit with a chair. Closed my laptop, went back to sleep. So that's what I was doing on that day.
Closed your laptop and went back to sleep. And as you sleep, how were your dreams?
I felt bad. I mean, I was at the start of my career. And as you well know, I've been on a bit of a political journey since then. But back then, I was a very strong Remainer. I was very much, considered myself a European.
You're still a European, Conor.
Well, I become Belgian now, so I'm
Oh, good.
officially
Very,
a
very
European.
much, yeah.
Yeah, but I don't know. Is anyone really a European? I
Yes.
don't know. Do you consider yourself
I
one?
definitely do, yeah. And the Europeans podcast, as we heard there, they're very much European. Shona, tell us, where were you when it happened?
Well, I was in London, actually, because I was covering the referendum. And I'd spent the year before walking the streets of the UK, in Bolton, in Northern Ireland, in Scotland, talking to people about Brexit. So I was a bit shocked. Right, because, everybody thought it's going to be 52-48 in favour of Remain. But I'd said this to people for several months beforehand. I said, people on the ground are voting for Brexit. The amount of people who I spoke to, I remember being in Bolton, I couldn't believe it. People were saying to me, I'm voting for Brexit. Why? Oh, the local council put up a new car park instead of dealing with the closed retail units. Nothing to do with the EU. One woman said, I'm voting for Brexit because there's too many Muslims. Then she said to me, it's okay, the Irish are grand. They built the roads. So I was okay somehow. Not one person said to me that the reason why they were voting for Brexit had anything to do with the European Union and the European Union control of the UK. It was a complete and utter rejection of, I suppose, years of maybe neglect in poorer parts of the UK, and also just a disillusionment with government as it had been. And then I remember the day of the referendum, I was in Lambeth. This was London, near Westminster. People were saying they're voting for Leave more so than I would have expected in that part of London. I thought, Jesus, this is an indication of something. Because, okay, maybe London will vote for Remain, but it's not in the very qualified, overarching way that I'd imagine. And then I thought about what I'd heard across England, in particular places like Dover, where they have a lot of trade coming through the EU, which they actually depend on European trade. And they voted for Brexit. I couldn't believe the amount of young people that are voting for Brexit. And just one more point, because one person I spoke to who was an official who dealt with sort of trade coming in and out of Dover and onto Rotterdam, places in the European continent. And he said to me, I'm the only person who worked here in the 80s before the single market. And I remember what it was like, how much of a nightmare it was with checks and regulation checks and so on. These people don't remember. They think they're going to get more jobs and it's going to be, a boon for the area. It's not. And that was the issue.
But Shona, if I can kind of like elaborate on that point and bring it to where we are today. And so I was a Remainer back during the referendum. I would say that probably if the 2016 result was for Remain, would probably have to have a second referendum, because the EU of 2016 is not the EU of 2026. And you're talking about trade and you're talking about customs. Well, look at what the EU is doing. It's become so inward looking and it's become so protectionist, right? If you look at made in Europe as a policy, excluding allies like Japan, like the UK, we've lost our confidence. And I think for the last 10 years, the EU has been buffeted by crisis after crisis after crisis.
Issue. But the other point is the UK was very much a driving force in the European Union, okay? So anything that has happened over the past 10 years, if the UK was still a member, they would have been front and centre of leading those changes, whether it's to do with legislation and enlargement or any of those issues, whether it's to do with COVID and so on. So you wouldn't have had to have a second referendum because your government would have been very much at the forefront of making those decisions, like they always were. Because this is a real nonsense that we heard throughout Brexit, which was the UK is being told by the faceless bureaucrats in Brussels what we have to do. No, the UK has had strong commissioners. The last commissioner they had, Lord Hill, was a commissioner for capital markets, which was really important for the UK's financial district. The UK had over 70 MEPs. The UK had always been very influential in EU politics.
Connor, just to go back to the point that Shona made when she was reporting on Brexit, that people, when they voted in favour of leaving the EU, they didn't really know what they were voting for. Can you relate to that? Because I know you have a lot of family members and friends back home who did vote for Brexit.
No, totally. And I think it's sort of, I think journalists often deploy this argument that people didn't really know all the facts and ins and outs of the EU before they voted for it. But is it really the same in any national politics? I mean, if you go to the same people, could they really tell you what
this is a really interesting question, Connor, right? Because first of all, I remember watching a programme with Michael Gove. I think Boris Johnson was on. It was a Channel 4 debate around the EU and the implications of leaving the EU. And Gove was asked specifically from a woman, I have a house in France. Will I still have access to my house in France the same way I do right now? She was told, absolutely, relax. Same access to the single market, same access to your house. This is not true because first of all, how would they know? Because they had negotiated Brexit. Second of all, Why would that woman have the same rights as an EU citizen when the UK vote to leave the EU? They were lied to. So they were definitely lied to.
But then look at the promises of the Remain campaign as well. I mean, continuity, the fact that the EU as existed in 2016 would continue. But like I just said,
continue when
it's
things
changed
change?
so much.
You had a global pandemic, a war on the continent, full-scale invasion. We've had Trump 2.1, Trump 2.0. We've had a war in Iran. We've had the collapse of Afghanistan. How could you just change and have the same EU as 2016? That doesn't make any sense.
No, I mean, well, look at the values of the EU in 2016, and people in the Remain campaign, as I was in the Remain campaign, we believed that the EU was a bastion of rights and democracy and liberty.
That's terrible. That's
Whereas
been
now,
watered down.
we have political parties being banned in all across member states. We have.
I totally agree. I'm very disappointed with the direction the EU is going myself. But does that mean I would want my own country to leave? No.
No, I don't think and on reflection, even today, I don't think I'd want to leave. I am sort of where the Patriots or the ECR are. I want to reform the EU. But this is the thing, right? I think nobody really disagrees with the fact that the EU needs to be reformed substantially now. And you've just said yourself that you disagree with the direction of
but that's
of the
because
EU.
people are voting to the far right, and that's a concern for
Why
me.
are people voting for the far right?
Rights.
The people are voting for the far right because they're so disillusioned with Europe.
Yeah.
We've had 10 years. We had 10 years where people voted, the major member states, to reject Europe, that there are huge problems with this organisation. We've had 10 years, and what have we done? We've got even worse.
How do you think the UK is doing? Is it in a better place now because it left?
Well, it's not in a better place because it left. It's not in a worse place because it left. I think if you ask anybody, if you're going to be serious, were the opportunities of Brexit taken? When you talk about the ability to sign free trade deals, when you talk about the ability to, deregulate, which was all promised and was never delivered upon. I admit it wasn't delivered upon.
But that's because obviously the geography it impacts that.
No, obviously, but I think people recognise that Brexit hasn't necessarily made the UK better, but the opportunity wasn't fully seized upon.
But I mean, it's not fair to say that the UK hasn't had an impact from Brexit. We know that there has been an impact in investment, unemployment, prospects. We saw, the fishing industry itself, which was supposed to be the main industry that was going to benefit from Brexit. Companies had to close up because they suddenly had this regulatory restrictions and accessing the markets that they used to sometimes fish waters from in Scotland, and that fish would be on the shelf in a shopping centre in Rotterdam. But that thing all fell apart because the EU or the UK.
And let's look ahead now to this summer. It will be a busy summer because at the end of July there's an EU-UK summit in the agenda. Shona Murray, what are the expectations for this gathering?
I think there's an expectation that there'll be closer ties for easier trade, in particular in the areas of fisheries that we mentioned earlier, and also agriculture, because there'll be an SBS agreement, which means that the UK will align with EU regulations when it comes to agriculture and so on, which means that you'll have a sort of frictionless trade in that area from the UK to the EU.
Is this welcomed, Connor, in your view?
No, I agree with Shona. That's probably what we're going to see. I just can't help but shake the feeling that whereas in the UK, especially in government, there is an appetite for greater engagement with the EU. And this is even amongst people in Brexit kind of territory. They want to see free trade agreements. They want to see closer cooperation with the EU, especially on security. I think in the European Commission, there's still quite a lot of hostility towards the United Kingdom. It's staffed full of British Europeans who took Belgian nationality, who have a very deep emotional resentment of the UK. I think in order to see any proper resumption of good relations, there has to be a couple of changes in the Commission first before we actually start to see real progress.
But I just don't think that there is a hatred of the EU. I think that the relations are actually improved. And I think it's mainly because of the UK's steadfast support of Ukraine and defence of European security that there is a much more sort of convivial workable relationship.
Which Europe should be thanking the UK for, by the way.
I think they should,
UK
and they have.
Absolutely saved Ukraine in the early days. We've been a leader in supporting Ukraine.
Yeah. And that's why there's a better relations. Yeah.
Indeed. Let us know what you think of the future of UK-EU relations and how you'll be marking this 23rd of June, 10 years on since the Brexit referendum. Connor Allen and Shona Murray, thank you so much for that firing debate.
Thank you,
Brexit, 10 years on,
everyone.
still igniting so much passion in our hearts.
So where would it be without it? We have nothing to talk about.
And thank you so much for listening. Thanks also to those behind the scenes, our sound technician, Georgios Lavaditis, our Brussels My Love producer, Alicia Carnivali, and our social media aide, Camden Buller. Let us know what you think of Brussels My Love. Reach out to us, brusselsmylove@euronews.com, or give us a rating. You can find us at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Take care and see you next time.
you.